All right, we'll be looking to get started. All right, good afternoon, everyone. If you would like to join us in public participation, feel free to pick up sheets of paper back on the table there and bring them forward. Little half sheets. We're going to go ahead and get started this evening. It is approximately 6:36, and I would like to, it is July 27th, 2017, and I would like to go ahead and call the Champaign County Racial Justice Task Force to order. Can I get a roll call, please?
Yes. Mariam Arahim. Sarah Balgoyan. Lynn Branham. Sam Bindum.
Here.
Ellen D. Alex Evans. Amy Felty. David Harbor. Ryan Hughes here. Artis James. Scott Lerner. Esther Pat. Carolyn Randolph. Henry Ross. Syl Shelton. Susan Silver. Demario Turner. Gerald Walter. Thank you.
All right, thank you, everyone. All right, we have approval of the agenda. All those in favor? Aye. Those opposed? Motion carried. Agenda is approved. Approval of minutes for July 13th, 2017. All those in favor? Aye. Those opposed? Motion carried. Approval of minutes has passed. Our next item on the agenda is public participation. Again, if anyone would like to participate, please feel free to grab a sheet of paper and fill it out and bring it to the front. Our first person who is up for public participation is James Kilgore. Please come on up.
Good evening.
Good evening.
So 2 weeks ago, I spoke at the last meeting, and I was quite upbeat about the Racial Justice Task Force bringing its work to an end and about the production of the reports and so forth. And I'm still very positive about the outcomes of the Racial Justice Task Force and its potential impact on racial justice in the county. At the same time, in the past couple of weeks, I've also had a little bit more time to read through the reports more carefully, and I wanted to make a couple of comments on a couple of the reports and then refer back to one of the recommendations I made at the meeting last time. So first off, I want to talk just briefly about the fines and fees report, which, I mean, it's a topic that I've studied quite a lot as part of the reentry work that I do, and I think it's an excellent report with very strong and solid recommendations. But I wanted to just make a couple suggestions as to things that might be added. I mean, one of the interesting facts about this is that over the weekend, we had a statement by Katie Blakeman, the county circuit clerk, that all of the revenue for the county circuit clerk's operations comes from fees and fines. And this is a national trend, and I think it needs to be noted that it's a worrying and a concerning trend because it means that a department within the criminal justice system is relying on increasing arrests to increase revenue. And there's a fundamental conflict of interest there that I think needs to be noted as one of the problems with fees and fines. And in terms of recommendations, I think there's a few other suggestions that could have been made in terms of how to bring relief to people who are suffering from large debt due to fees and fines. The first would be to recommend an amnesty for old debt, for debt that's a certain number of years old, or something which is essentially never going to be collected and is not doing either the county or the person who owes the money any good. The second would be a possibility of doing community service to pay off debt for people who don't have the means to pay them. The third would be to schedule some kind of payment plans, like the way in which people pay bills. And the last would be, and something that's not maybe mentioned, but in the county, if you're on probation and you complete your probation without any violations, but you still owe money, in your record it says you unsuccessfully completed your probation. And I think that's an unfair penalty, which basically is not penalizing someone for behavior or violations, but penalizing them for lack of funds. So I think that could be a recommendation that that clause be removed. So the second report I want to comment on is the report on structural racism. And I mean, I must say that having to make these comments is troubling, because I've invested a lot in the Racial Justice Task Force, but structural racism is a topic that, I mean, I've actually been an anti-racist activist for more than 4 decades. I've studied this academically. I've written about it. I mean, I've been an activist in Southern Africa and in the United States fighting for racial justice. And this structural racism section is totally inadequate. It does not reflect the fundamental understanding of the term structural racism. Structural racism takes place in institutions, policies, and practices. It's carried out by people, and it's perpetuated by people. And the most essential thing about structural racism that is missing is that someone benefits from structural racism. It's not a neutral process that simply carries on by itself. And we can't talk about structural racism without naming some names. White people benefit from structural racism. White-led, white-dominated political institutions benefit from structural racism, and that's what makes it so difficult to change. That's just not reflected in the paper. So I think that in its present form, or anything like its present form, I think that that report should not appear in the final report of the Racial Justice Task Force. And I say this because, frankly, I want to be able to take that Racial Justice Task Force report, and I want to be able to show it to people around the country to say, you see, this is what a small county in the middle of the cornfields can produce on racial justice without even a penny from the county to carry out their work. But if that structural racism piece appears in this report, I will not show it to anyone. And I will distance myself from that report, and I think other people will. So I hope that you'll spend some time this evening carefully considering the importance of this. And I think it's particularly important because it's such a huge section of the report. It overshadows everything else, and apparently efforts to persuade the author of the report to reduce the size have been unsuccessful. And I mean, so I think that's a very serious matter. And then this brings me to my last point. In my presentation last time, I said that I thought it's something that the Racial Justice Task Force should do, and it's something that takes courage, and that is you should write about your process. You should write in particular about the racial dynamics within the Racial Justice Task Force, and this is going to be painful. This is going to be difficult, but it will be courageous. It will be courageous of you to confront the structural racism section head on, and it will be courageous of you to make a decision to talk about the racial dynamics and to make it part of what you have to say, because this is something that you have to contribute to other people who are trying to do what you've been doing. And you have a lot to teach other people, and you don't have to sugarcoat everything and say it's all been, we've all had a great time here. You need to identify some of the problems and challenges that you've faced, some of the things you've done successfully and unsuccessfully to address these, and share those with people. That will be a very courageous act. I hope you'll be able to do some of that. I don't expect you to write a PhD dissertation on this, but a few comments I think would be very, very powerful. I thank you very much.
Thank you. Any questions, comments?
I was going to say, I just wanted to say thank you for the review of all the sections. I know community engagement really appreciated your comments, your approval, and your support. It gave us a lot of hope for the work that we've done. And I know this was difficult for you to say some of these things. When the structural section was put together, when we divided into groups, into 5 groups to write, that name structural was literally thrown out one night. I mean, I think it was just kind of tagged onto the group. And originally it was called the Education, Housing, and Employment portion. Does that help at all? Because I know we should talk about the involvement with the concept of structural racism. Do you understand what I'm saying or not?
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. I mean,
Is it a terminology issue, or is it the section itself?
I don't think giving it a different title is going to make it a much better document. For me, I mean, I didn't talk about some of the stylistic problems with it as a research document. I mean, I think it's problematic. It wanders. It doesn't stay on topic. I mean, I don't want to do a whole sort of academic critique, but I think that the troubles with it are beyond even the politics that I've spoken about.
Any other questions, comments? All right, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Actually, I had a comment.
Oh, hold on.
I
one moment.
also wanted to thank you for your comments and specifically discussing and encouraging us to write about our process and the racial dynamics of our report and making sure that we highlight some of the problems, challenges, as well as successes that we've had. And I'm hoping that as we move forward on what we will do in terms of finalizing the report, that we have a serious and frank discussion about what that will look like. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you again. We have another public participation. Albert Stabler.
Hi, I didn't have time to print, so pardon me while I get set up here. This is going to be less dynamic than James because I'm reading what letter that I wrote on behalf of Build Programs Not Jails, where I of course work with James, who just spoke. But this is a letter that many folks on the task force I think have seen. But I just want to read it into the public record here. As a group, several of us from Build Programs Not Jails have read the drafts of nearly all the sections. Those we have seen have either adequately or admirably met the mandate set up by the Community Justice Task Force. The 2-page sections on reforming local fines and fees, which are an undue burden on poor people and people of color, and public housing, which needs to be made available to people leaving jail and prison, are concise, well-researched, clear, and contain specific recommended actions for the county board. The sections on juvenile justice and restorative justice contain several potentially beneficial ideas and suggestions for implementation and make mention of racial disparity. The section on community engagement, which deals with transparency and communication regarding criminal justice policies, makes ambitious recommendations and clearly addresses the role of race. The section that is truly alarming to us is the section on structural racism. It has a range of problems, the first being that it is at least 6 times longer than any other section. The second being that it makes no recommendations that can be directly acted upon by the county board. The third being its overall disorganization in terms of format. The fourth being its broad generalizations and its moralizing tone. And the fifth being its lack of insight as regards race. The essay, while pointing out some problematic policies, has no critical assessment of whiteness or blackness as political facts. It deals at length with psychological factors of racism for white people, which are hardly structural issues. And it makes broad and ultimately unrealistic claims and recommendations as regards the legal and economic factors that could legitimately be thought of as structural. In addition, it is the product of one task force member who seemingly has communicated with but has not collaborated with her subcommittee, which includes people of color. We feel that the inclusion of this section without a substantial reduction in length and a corresponding increase in focus will distract and comfort many white readers, including some members of the county board, and it will allow the county board to praise the report and congratulate themselves while not making any hard decisions as regards criminal justice. While the structural racism section contains a lot of interesting information, it is inappropriate for a report such as this, and will make it much more difficult for it to be understood and acted upon in and beyond Champaign County. Criminal justice is why the RJTF exists, and any part of this report that endangers even the most minor rollback of punitive racist state practices should be stricken.
All right, thank you.
Bert, can
Or-
you,
yeah.
can you email that statement to me so I can put it in the minutes, please?
Yep, I sure can.
Thank you.
I got it. I'll send it to you. Any comments, questions? Okay. Thank you. Our next agenda item is presentations. And so review final drafts from subcommittees. How would we like to proceed?
Would it be helpful to, for the subcommittees to highlight any changes that have been made since, or things that they've had feedback on in the since the last meeting, to start with on each section? Just a suggestion.
But you want each subcommittee, once they start giving a presentation, they can highlight the changes at that time, not, randomly.
Right, yeah.
Okay, okay, yeah. I just, yes, each subcommittee, yes.
All right. Let's go with juvenile justice.
So there have been some changes in the report since, some just grammatical, small things, and others to reflect some of the comments from last time. I did pare down some of the SRO data, and we've added on to the recommendations. One major thing is to eliminate or stop detaining youth under 13 in the detention center. It's a practice that isn't used often, but occasionally that's the only place for young people who are potentially a harm to themselves or others, because there is not another facility that is a place where they could go. So that's been an added recommendation. The recommendations have gotten really long, a lot of them. So I'm thinking about feedback on maybe collapsing some into each other, or if there are some that we want to highlight, more. And then also, I just got confirmation today that I can get some data around numbers on diversion, which is not easily, you can't just pull that off of anybody's site, or especially because they're kids, and diversion can be sometimes less formal, right? So I got confirmation today that I can get those numbers to compare it, so that we can see how many kids are being diverted from the system and from detention, and see if there are racial disparities in that as well. So I'd like to ask for a little more time to add that data into our section to be sure that we're giving the big picture, and get, honor some of the good work that is happening potentially, and/or things that we could make more recommendations around increasing or improving or changing. So that's my brief summary. I don't know, Scott or Mariam, if there's anything to add.
Any comments or questions?
I've just got a couple of comments. Wait, let me find it. On the recommendation, it's really good, by the way, and I like the way you got it down. It's really manageable. The first recommendation, I know what you're getting at, but I think you need to be more specific. If you say official acknowledgement by the Champaign County Board of the racial disparities, improper and overuse of punitive measures for Black youth in the juvenile justice system, with a commitment to make change to address the disparity. If I were a county board member, I wouldn't know what you want me to do. So if you could be more like, if you want the county board to pass a resolution, you could say that, but if you want them to do something more than that, or if that's an overall, that you want the Champaign County Board to recognize racial disparities, improper and overuse of punitive measures for Black youth in the juvenile justice system, and with a commitment to implement these other recommendations. I'm not sure what exactly you had in mind with that, but I'm just saying right now, I think it's especially if we want to say the county board should do something, we need to tell them what to do. And then a few other things. You use passive voice in a lot of these, and it may be because there's more than one actor, but redevelopment of the countywide juvenile justice council to well, no, that wasn't a good one. Increase, where is it? Like reduce detention center population and the use of the center as a holding facility. I mean, I think that one's really good, but can you direct to who should make sure that happens? And maybe you can't. Maybe it's just these are like collaborative goals. And definitely, but number 6 was one jumped out. It says provide support for community awareness of the existing community resources that can help. Who do you want to provide that support? And do you mean financial support, or do you just mean that the community should? You know what I'm saying? If you can specify that. And there was one other one. Wait. Yeah, also increase the investment, again, number 11, do you mean financial? Increase the investment in relationship and connection-centered programs and organizations, including mentor programs, midnight basketball. And if you mean that school districts, park districts, cities, the county, et cetera, should do all that, say that. Okay. Which I think, is that what you meant? Kind of like that, or just think of it, if there's anything where you can name partners, I think that's best, because then it's easier to direct to them that, well, the report said. Right. Yeah, but it's really good, and thank you for the work.
Yeah, in response, I appreciate all those, and you're right, I don't, I think naming the who and the what in some of these could really strengthen them. Yeah. The acknowledgement piece, was kind of going off of James's recommendations last time to really call for some action around, number 1, we have an issue and we need to address it officially, making that, but I don't know what that looks like, so I don't know what a resolution would do in that case, or if that's what we want to say or do, or if there's some other formal way to acknowledge it, which maybe just by creating the Racial Justice Task Force was the official acknowledgement, and we can drop that, I'm not sure. So I'm open to however folks think that we could or should make that a thing. I don't know.
I would just ask them to pass a resolution acknowledging the disparities, and I don't think it's covered by the creation of the Racial Justice Task Force, because yours is specific to Black youth in the juvenile justice system.
One quick thing. I'm looking, with that first one, I'm looking to see, and I'm sure you can point to me for it, what are the improper and overuse of punitive measures for Black youth as opposed to other youth? What do you say in here?
Detention. So, there's the disparities in who's in detention is apparent. And so.
Right. But I mean, are there things that are done to Black youth that are not done to white youth who are in detention? Or are you not saying that?
No, that's not what I'm saying. I think what I'm saying is to be really intentional about looking at the use of punitive measures and detention and other things specifically when looking at the young Black population.
I wonder if that could be maybe a little bit clearer, because it sounds in the recommendation like Black youth are treated differently in detention than white youth in detention.
Sending youth to the detention center is a punitive measure. And to find ways to keep them in the community, particularly the very young kids, is what that's after. But it can be tweaked to be made clearer.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that. I just when I looked at that from a little distance, I see, oh, there must be something in here that says that Black youth are treated differently than white youth. And I don't find that in the report, but I don't disagree with what's there, it just could be misleading.
Any other questions or comments? Okay. Let's look at restorative justice and practices.
Okay, so two major changes in the restorative practices piece. Sorry, it still is small print. I didn't realize it was still in that format. My bad. So two big things is one is we added a third letter C under number 2 type of circle. That's called a restorative circle. Wanted to highlight that because it is happening here locally at Urbana School District and in the community, and there's support for that here, and has a proven track record to address some racial issues in other communities, and so racial crimes and issues that are related to race. So we wanted to be sure that that data and that information was available. And then the third thing was, or the second thing, excuse me, was addressing the racism components or possibilities of in restorative practices when improperly managed or oversight and inclusion that was missing from this. And thank you, Carolyn, again for the input on that. It was helpful to have some real intentional language around being sure that the planning committee, number 1, and the practices themselves, and then the evaluations of would be mindful of the disparities and the structural racism that can be a part of these things. Do you want to add to that?
The only thing that I would add is, I think, because of the comments we got from everyone, but what we received from Carolyn has significantly strengthened this piece. The only caveat I would add is that I'm a little wary, because I've done a lot of work in the past on community sentencing, that the standards that are applied when looking at the effectiveness of community sentences, for example, are not the same standards we apply to prisons and jails. So I think we need to put this in here, that we need to have, that evaluation, we need to have that inclusion in planning. But those same standards should apply across the board. So I think probably it'll be in August when we talk about evaluation overall, but I don't want to just have restorative justice treated differently. We need the same kind of inclusiveness and transparency across the board, because if more light was shed on what happens with jails and prisons, we wouldn't have the system we have right now.
All right, any questions or comments? Okay, let's move on to police practices.
I'm going to do it from up here for 2 reasons. One, well, actually, one reason, which is that you don't have it in front of you. Yeah. I thought I had sent it to Kay yesterday, and I suppose I had not. And it was updated last night. And so let me pull it up real quickly. Bert and James, have you guys seen the police practices section? You have not? Okay, all right. I'll forward that to you. We received comments from Lynn and from Carolyn. And then I also have a great section that we're trying to work in from Ellen on community policing. Ellen did a great job, a great deal of research into community policing, and wrote a 2-page summary on that. So the major change that still needs to occur is to figure out how we're going to include parts of this section into our overall section. if you recall from police practices, I hate to do this to everyone and have you look at the screen, but our first recommendation is focused on community collaboration. And so I think Ellen's section on community policing will either lead into this or parts of it will fall under this recommendation. Carolyn, can you talk about the change you asked for regarding training? Was it training that you mentioned? No. I'm forgetting what you had asked for that we put in. Was it about community policing? Yes, well, yes, okay. Never mind. Carolyn suggested something and we put it in there. And it's very good, and you should all support it. And then Lynn gave a lot of comments that, Lynn, the most recent comments that you sent, I think yesterday, the day before, I incorporated most of the changes, including some of the word changes. We took out exorbitant to define the fees that are applied to people. And then since last time, we have a footnote talking about the Police Training Institute, giving a little background on, we kind of shifted this training recommendation. We flipped it on its side so that the focus is more on requirements for multicultural awareness and implicit bias training for all departments. And then as a sub piece to that, or subcomponent to that, we talk about how the county board should support the continuation of the U of I PTI. And we talk about why that is in danger of being dismissed in the endnotes.
So Ryan,
Yes,
I did
Esther.
get a chance to look at
Okay.
my notes.
Yeah, there we go.
So in terms of the police training curriculum, we said that it needs the input of community members and should be updated regularly. We also asked for community members to be involved in having conversations with police officers, making sure that it's not just a one-sided conversation, but ensuring that their concerns and questions are heard.
So a big focus on community involvement, both in policing and in the training components. And Lynn, I think, recommended adding a note about publication of demographic data of the local agency's staff members and police officers, so we added that in there. That's this sentence here. Lynn, I think I put it in the black there for you. You asked for that in the bold. Local law enforcement agencies should implement similar strategies to increase the diversity of staff, and data on the diversity of staff and officers should be published annually. Those are the major changes I would say. We also, Amy gave me comments on PTI at our last meeting, and so I pared that down a little bit to make it more apparent that this section on PTI is just an informational section for the public who reads this report, saying, hey, look, we met with the PTI, we got one side of the story, here's some information that we learned. We're not going to jump too specifically into advocating for this or that part of PTI or say that it's overwhelmingly great, because we only have anecdotal evidence that it's highly supported. We talked about this last time. So I think that we paired this, we altered the language a little bit to make that more apparent. Yes, Esther?
When I brought up about the effort to try to keep it at U of I because of the specified training, there was some disagreement about whether U of I's training is unique, but the point isn't whether it's at U of I per se. The point is that training that is going now, that Mariam, you're involved with that, right? Or were you?
I just occasionally, I come in
Okay.
to participate in the training.
Okay, but there are some local people who participate in the training that, at least from some people's perspective, that's not what's happening at the other PTIs. So I think the most important recommendation, and it just, without it in front of me, I can't see if that's in there. The most important part of the recommendation is, I mean, other than I think you include in there that all offers, that should be mandatory, not voluntary, right? I mean, that's probably the most important, but also what is mandatory, not voluntary? There's some way to describe what it is that Mariam has been involved in, and Sundiata, and whoever else that we know has been doing it, that people think is really good, if there's some way to describe that, to make sure that that's what we're recommending PTI do, that's really what's most important, right? I mean, that's, yeah. Because it's not the obsession with this location, it's the fear that a different location will not have access to the same human resources here to present the training, and so if they want to move it someplace else, they got to figure out a way to move that high-quality training or replicate it elsewhere, and so, do you think it says that in there now, without it in front of me to read through quickly? I can't.
I'll look through it.
If you
and
look,
make
if you just
sure
look
it
for that,
does,
because that
and see
should
what
be,
we need
that
to
should
add
be
to
the
make that
point.
clear. Yep.
Yeah, thank you.
Lynn, did I miss anything major from, yeah, okay, yeah. And we can always go
So
through
did
it
we
again.
establish, just listening to what Esther said, we never established this was a high-quality program or not independently of the program, is that correct? I mean, I'm not saying
Yeah,
it
no,
is or
that, I
isn't.
would say that's correct.
So I would not want to advocate that the county advocate for the program based on a recommendation that we can't make, saying that it's a high-quality program. But if we say it appears from what they said that there are really good resources here, and that we could say that, but we couldn't say that we know it's a high-quality program because we haven't vetted the results of it.
Well, that's what I was suggesting, if there's a way to describe what it is, that is what should be done at all PTIs throughout the state, really, and of course, the county board can't control what happens elsewhere in the state, but that actually, our recommendation is that this type of training should be mandatory and for all police officers, which I think is so obvious, and that, and just some way of describing it to make sure that it's not just that you just have to do something that you call diversity training and then it counts, but, and I don't know if there is a way to describe specifically that, I mean, I don't know, because I don't know enough about it. I just know that lots of people seem to think it's good, and, or at least better than anything else, and if there's just a way to try to describe that in there, then we don't even have to get into the names of people presenting or what institution, or say this one's best, just such training should do X, Y, Z.
Yeah,
is kind of
based
what I
on
was thinking,
outcomes,
yeah.
and we don't
Yeah.
have those outcomes. We don't know the results of the training based on some objective outcome
Oh, I see
scale,
what
so
you're
we
saying,
can
yeah.
measure it. And so I don't think we can advocate that the program is high quality. We can say they say it's high quality, and we can list, as you did in that section, how many hours of this and that and so on. But I think we have to be really careful not to advocate for something we haven't personally at some way investigated, because then we're falling into the trap of, well, somebody else said this and therefore we think it should happen. That's just not investigation of truth, and that's not looking objectively and closely at something to make that kind of recommendation.
Are we comfortable with making a recommendation that the county board should advocate for the U of I PTI staying here because of the value that brings, that Esther's talking about, which is that the county, the people here, the community can have influence over the programming, not because we have seen the outcomes that the training is exactly what we want it to be?
What would that influence look like? How would a county board
Well,
influence it? We might be able to say that, but what are we looking,
well,
increasingly?
I think that's
yeah.
what Esther is getting at. The influence may not be the county board, but the influence is Mariam, who goes every couple of weeks or months or whatever to be there. The influence is coming from the U of I collaborations. But you're saying that we don't even know that those influences that the community members have are presenting.
I'm remembering what Mariam said, which is she would improve that program, didn't you? The diversity part.
The conversation we had was around the fact that this particular program has a cultural piece, and that it is in the curriculum, but it's optional. However, our local jurisdictions require that our trainees take it. In addition, other programs around the country don't even have it. So that's where the discussion came to recommend the local PTI, that the county board support it and in some way try to retain it. So, and that was the piece, that in most police trainings, there is no coverage of cultural competency, cultural differences, none of that. And so that's a kind of unique piece for the local one. So, and then I did want to say this, that another, even sometimes a county board member, Geraldo Rosales, sometimes participates in that piece also. So there are community people who are very well versed on the issues of those kinds of things that makes it valuable for our local police forces. So that, as I said, the Champaign, Urbana, and the sheriff required that their trainees attended. Does that help in any way?
Well, it clarifies it more. I don't know what the task force will decide, of
I've gotten
course.
us into the weeds, and I said I didn't want to do that. So what needs to happen is we need to work this out some more. And so I'll work with Amy and Mariam and Carolyn and whoever else wants to have input on this section and Esther to tweak it so it's something we're more in favor of.
If we had anything in the country that, Mariam, that you know about that is an excellent program with the outcomes of officers coming out with the kind of mindset that allows for the community policing that apparently we are looking at, that would be wonderful to say, we'd like them to review their curriculum and make sure it matches something as good as this program seems to be. I don't know.
No, I don't think any program has a pre and post assessment for the officers.
Right, because a lot of successful kind of long-term data on that would be reliant also on ongoing PD and training and updating, which some police departments don't do frequently. So I don't know that there is like a gold standard thing that's over the next 30 years of your career, you're going to get all of these trainings that will lead to a, X outcome of, whatever the outcomes would be. So that might be hard to grapple with.
The only question I'd have, and it's just more a question if you're looking for something like that, I certainly know because I was on the Commission on Accreditation for Corrections for like 15 years or something, but there are standards specifying areas that need to be covered in training, and I know police departments are accredited. So if there are accreditation standards that point to that, that could be just something. And again, I haven't looked at those standards.
If I could just make two comments. One, for those people on the task force who have soft voices, pull the mic closer, because I've noticed several times when one of you speaks that people in the audience are going like this, which is to let us know they can't hear. But just another, this is not, I'll get with you other specific things, but in general for all these things, we talk about things like the county board should advocate for keeping, if you want to make the recommendation, keep it U of I. Yeah, the county board does not have the legal authority to make it be there, but the county board or the city council or the racial justice task force or anybody can advocate for something, and it's significant. And the PTI at U of I was going to close, and it didn't. And I don't know details of what it was Mayor Pressing did, but the News Gazette, who doesn't exactly love her, did this editorial saying that she's remarkable that she did this all. I don't know what I assume a word people sometimes are offended by because they think of politics and they think it's negative, but lobbied. I think she just lobbied and got enough people to change their minds. And if the county board thought that were a priority, that would be something they could do. And there's several different levels when it comes to things like when we talk about state legislation. And this is for all that's why I mentioned this now. This is for all of our reports. Anything not that we want to dump everything on the county board, but there is a role for the county board in lots of different ways. Which includes just like whether you mentioned, like passing a resolution or lobbying, or for things that involve statewide decisions. The county board is a member of the county board associations of Illinois or America. I mean, there are actual paid lobbyists who lobby municipal issues and county issues and whatnot. So there are lots of different vehicles where if the county board chose to take up on one of these recommendations, there is something for them to do. So I would not take out anything about the county board should work toward or advocate or whatever it is you decide you want to put in there.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
And thank you. This is really good.
All right, thank you. All right, community engagement.
Okay, so with community engagement, I want to mainly focus on our recommendations. The recommendation 1, the practice of non-media related community engagement, that was a new addition. That goes from A and B. 2 is fairly the same. There were no changes made to that. Oh, I'm sorry, it was 2E, which was to rebuild the current county website to make it more accessible and user-friendly, and to include live streaming and/or an archive of video recorded county board meetings. The one that I really want to bring your attention to is 3C. That was a recent addition. The remaining A, B, D, and E were already available on our July 13th meeting and prior to our July 13th meeting. And that was to appoint a community engagement oversight commission tasked to monitor the implementation of these recommendations, specifically the setting of benchmarks and the periodic assessment of progress in the reduction of racial disparity, and you can continue to read on. And we made that addition because we were not sure what our plan was going to be as a county board in terms of implementing or asking for those kind of implementations. So 3C was the one that is the newest, but the remaining recommendations have been there. Am I missing anything? I think 3C was the latest.
Okay. Any questions or comments?
Yeah, I had some comments. I sent an email. My guess is most of you did not get it because I sent it later this afternoon, but somebody got it and actually made some copies just so you could see. There are several changes that I'm going to be asking be made, and I'd explain why. And 2, I didn't know, if you don't mind, we're going to have to kind of share because we didn't have enough, because hats off to you. She knew it was colored, and she had a color printer and reached out to me. Yeah. Yeah. So, but it's hard to talk about language changes without seeing them. But so I had 4 language changes that I think are important to make. And then there were just 2 things. These are highlighted in color, the changes that I'm recommending be made that are, I'm sorry, they're highlighted in red. And then the things that are highlighted in yellow are just kind of some things that we may, what we decide in August may affect those subjects. But let me just kind of dive into this. There are 4 sentences that I feel for several different reasons. I guess I'd have to say I have concerns about all of them, and they're the same concerns. The first sentence is the first sentence in this. It says, let me just see if I can find it here. I've got too many copies here. The racial disparity observed in Champaign County's criminal justice system and in other interlocking community agencies and institutions result from race-based discrimination. Then on the next page, third section, first sentence says racial disparity is a result of racism or discrimination based on race. Here's my concern about those sentences. I 100%, 200% agree, and the research is very solid on this, that racial discrimination is a big part of why we have racial discrimination in the criminal justice system is an important factor as to why we have racial disparity. We know that beyond a shadow of a doubt, for example, from the research about disparity in traffic stops. The research is also strong, though, that it is not just racial discrimination. Racial discrimination I'm using in the term of actions being taken because of adverse actions because of somebody's race. So stopping somebody because the police officer sees, for example, that that person is a person of color. It happens It's got to stop. We've got some recommendations bearing on that. The second factor contributing to racial disparity in our criminal justice system, main factor, is what are called race-neutral policies, but they have a disparate impact on people of color. A classic example, we've talked about this, is cash bail. Cash bail adversely affects people who are white and people of all races who are poor. But cash bail and the fees that we've talked about have a disproportionate impact on African Americans because they are disproportionately low income. So that's an important piece. That's what we primarily as a task force have been looking at as the factors contributing to racial disparity. There's another piece we haven't focused on, and I don't think we can focus on it, but there is disproportionality in the commission of serious violent crimes by African Americans. That is nationally and that is locally. And the most prominent criminologists in this country have written about this. The statistics are there. If we look at armed robberies and murders in our own community, that is a piece of this. Now, people can debate what percentage each one of those pieces are, and the researchers have done that. But here's why I'm bringing this to the attention of the task force. And my only regret, and maybe this is the kind of thing, although my own view is that this goes maybe elsewhere as guidance to future task forces, is that this discussion hadn't occurred earlier, because it seems to have, it seems to be considered controversial. But here is the problem with saying this is all because of racial discrimination. One, it's not true with the research. Two, we will lose the people we want to effect change. The second, because that sentence basically says you are all racist. You cops, you prosecutor, you judges, and go through the line, and we will lose them. I promise you that. So I feel we don't have to get into that briar patch. I suggested language that is actually very neutral, doesn't get into those complexities. As a community, I feel we will have to talk about some of that. And I think one reason why the disproportionate offending issue is controversial is because people think it's pointing fingers. And that actually is what happens. I've heard criminal justice officials speak in those terms. And we've seen that even in the interviews. We, the police, have no role to play in reducing racial disparity. It's all the community, and that's a code word for African American community. But to not acknowledge that there is a disproportionate number, or to have language here that suggests we do not have 14% of the arrests for murder right now. There is that disproportionality. So I think it's important to be accurate. And if we, those four sentences, again, they don't help, and they will hurt the cause of eliminating racial disparity. So the sentences, again, those were two, and I had language, instead of saying the racial disparities, oh, good heavens, I need my own red copy, result from race-based discrimination. Instead of saying that, to say they stem from an interplay of customs, procedures, rules, practices, and routines. So taking out race-based discrimination inherent in a system and then replacing it with language that's general enough to keep it open. By the way, I have no problem with, if we want to talk about those three main factors. I'm sensing that some people feel so uncomfortable.
If you're asking me if we would like to talk about them, yeah, maybe we should be given an opportunity to talk about them.
Well, exactly. So I just wanted to flag the changes.
You're repeating exactly what you said 2 weeks ago at the meeting. This is taking 10, 15 minutes. It took 10, 15 minutes before. I appreciate the fact that Carolyn wasn't here last time to hear you. I do appreciate that. But we're not talking, we're not having a dialogue when you're giving a monologue.
Sorry, I was just explaining why, because, again.
I understand.
All right, so I'll stop.
We're
If
not
you- All right, okay, go ahead.
Slow, and we get it, okay. First of all, you mentioned in an email Bloomstein's research, which I assume is what you're presuming to present to us as definitive criminology.
It's one of, I mean, I've got.
I got the rest too.
Okay.
Can I take Bloomstein first?
Please.
Thank you. Two key criticisms of Bloomstein's research are they do not deal with the commission of crimes. They deal with the arrests for crimes. Bloomstein relies on arrest statistics. Arrest data may be valid in showing potential for post-arrest discrimination, but it's not the same as the commission of a crime. And to say, as you did, and I think that was the response here, that African Americans commit more crimes. Correct me then. You said commission.
Serious,
I
no,
wrote the quote.
serious, violent. Okay, so it was not most crime, by any means, okay? So
I disagree with you on that as well, but you are rescinding the term commission. You said they commit more crimes, responsible for the commission. Bloomstein only deals with the point of arrest, and I understand that we're dealing with the criminal justice system, but I think that's a slight to African Americans. If you're going to start with police reports or actually crime, that's a different issue, I think you'd have to agree, than arrest for a crime. I'll give you an example. According to City of Urbana Open Data Portal 2016, there were 4 reported homicides in 2016 in Urbana. During the same time period, there were 3 individuals arrested for murder. One of those arrested was black, while the other 2 were white. 4 murders, 3 arrests. That's not the same thing. The arrests are not the same as the murders that were committed during that time frame. I can acknowledge that 1 out of the 3 people arrested was African American. Got that. But I can't say that 1 out of 4 in the commission of the crimes, the reported homicides, was African American. We don't know that. Second example, in 2017, there were 9 reported discharge of weapons in Urbana. And why am I pointing to Urbana? That's the only data statistics that we have available to us. We do not have a data portal to be able to put this together. This has been something we've been trying to get. 9 reports of discharge of a weapon. The shots were fired in many cases, but in some cases, shots are fired and there's no criminal complaint. We don't even know. Every morning I walk in Meadowbrook Park, I hear shots fired every single morning from the Police Training Institute. Multiple shots every single day, actually. Those do not go reported. Those are not part of the 9 that are reported. The commission of a crime and the reportage of a crime and the arrests for the crime are not the same things at all. The 2 arrests have been made during the same time frame for discharge of weapons. Both arrests were made in May. Both arrested were black males. 2 arrests for black males, 9 discharge of a weapon. Now, one way you could look at that is 100% of the people arrested were African Americans. I get that. But you can't say that 100% of the people that fired a weapon in a discharge were African Americans. You can only say that perhaps 2 out of the 9 were. Does it make sense?
I guess what I'm saying is this, and now I almost feel like I'm reluctant to talk because I've been told that I'm speaking too much, but.
No, I'm just trying to point out that in the last year and a half, you have probably dominated every single meeting. A lot of people have left this group. A lot of people's voices have been silenced. I think that we do hear over and over and over again from one perspective, and I'm sorry that if I ate up 5 minutes of your life.
No, but what was just about to say, but I was reluctant to take the time, is that that's kind of my point, what was just said. So that kind of statistics that you're saying, can we say right now that the only cause of the disparity in the criminal justice system in Champaign County is racial discrimination in the criminal justice have we collected that data? Can we point to that?
No, and we can't say the opposite. We can't say that, as you did, the majority of crimes committed, you did say that, by African Americans, and that's why I jumped.
Okay, so that's what I did not mean, because what I wrote.
Thank you.
Serious violent, and was in the email that I had written to the subcommittee.
Do you
is
have
serious
information on serious violent?
In Champaign, no.
Then we can't say that.
Which is why I'm saying we should eliminate that language and keep it neutral so there can be more discussion on, we cannot say it is, that's what I'm saying. If we cannot say that it is all due to racial discrimination, and if we say that, I mean, for example, the cash bail, that is considered a race neutral, so that a white person who is poor cannot get out. So it's not considered.
I hope I'm not
Okay,
grasping at
wait a
straws here, and I'll let Miriam
okay.
speak, but,
Cash bail is not race neutral,
well, that's true.
okay? It's just not.
But
But one thing, let's just cut to the chase because this conversation is gonna get circular and it's gonna keep going. Okay, so if in fact you feel that this sentence says that that's the only contributing factor, then that can be modified to say that it is a major contributing factor, okay? But I'm not gonna speak for Carolyn, but as a part of this, group, personally, I resent the way you tore up this report and put all your red sugar honey iced tea in it, okay? And you didn't do it to any of the others. So I don't know about them, but I'll be strongly advocating, you can't talk about unpleasant things and use pleasant words. When it's something that's ugly and mean-spirited, you have to talk about it and use language that describes ugliness and mean-spiritedness. Racism is ugly and mean-spirited. So we're not gonna use a neutral language. What does that even mean? You know, I'm feeling passionate, so don't think I'm angry at you. I'm very passionate about this, okay? Because as an African-American woman in this country whose family and extended family has experienced generations of racism, there's no neutral language that can be used to describe that. And so, we're not gonna speak, I think it's inappropriate to think that this report should come out in one voice when numerous people have contributed to it. So it's okay for it to have multiple voices. And so, if it can be tweaked to say that it's one of many factors or something like that, but to say, and if people run screaming from the room because they hear hard facts, that is on them. That's on them. As this racial justice task force, it's important for us to speak the truth. And I don't know if you are familiar with Fannie Lou Hamer, who coined the phrase, speak truth to power. That's what should be happening here.
And speaking of that, yeah, I probably jumped the gun on that too. Thank you, Miriam. This is the result of a year's worth of our lives, what you have in front of you. We have 2 PhDs on our group. We have a strong commitment to what we're doing. We have done the best. We've edited, we've re-edited, we've written, we've rewritten. We tried to take into account everybody's thoughts and everybody's feelings. We tried to represent each voice individually. Last week, I commented about that phrase and spoke to that, saying it was the voice of an individual. I think we need to have the voices of individuals. I agree. I don't think we need to have a unified voice. I don't think we have to speak as one if that means silencing people and disregarding people's feelings and disregarding their life experiences. I'd rather see a report that reflects the diversity of thoughts and ideas and opinions and feelings and wordings. That's why I jumped.
Thank you. I'd like to say a few things. First of all, it really is a violation of decorum to zero in on one member and pick on them. But since people have, I would like to say that I'm sorry if anyone's offended. If anyone thinks that doing the rewrite that Lynn did on this section is something that was just done to you or picked on you, at least every single thing I've written has gotten numerous rewrites, right up to including when I communicated, the message that was read tonight from Build Programs Not Jails originally had criticism of things that I wrote, and I wrote back to them and said, tell me what you want different. And Mr. Kilgore came tonight and proposed some things that are different, so okay, we can do that too. But it's really, I mean, if anybody has such a strong feeling of ownership over what they wrote that they have to respond in personal attacks of individual members who comment, that doesn't help any process anywhere. And I'm not sure of this, but I think it's quite possible that Lynn Branham, of all the members of the task force, has actually done more writing than and more editing of other people's writing than anyone else's, because she just has, and she appears to be very engaged. But I mean, there are at least 5 things in here that she has had a hand in. It's hard when we get all this stuff at once for all of us to go through and do this edit, but I am the person who copied her email, because when I read it, I thought, there's no way you can discuss it with having it in front of you, and that Kay didn't have a chance to photocopy it if she just sent it out this afternoon at 1 o'clock or whatever, and I thought people should have a look at it. I did suggest to her to not even make any arguments, just put it in front of you, and all of you look at it, the changes she made, and see, do you think that is good, or do you think, if you think it's worse, take it out. If you think it's unnecessary, say so, but to look at it that way. And this whole discussion about this one section, this is relevant to many of our other reports too. In many places, and just let me think about when we get to the final draft, like I was mentioning in Sarah's about when you use passive voice, it's not clear who you're directing to do something. And likewise, this does not say that racial disparity in the criminal justice system is a result of the racism and discrimination by people who administer the system. It doesn't say that. But if I infer correctly, Lynn's point is there's a whole lot of people who see it that way, and really, racial disparity is a result of racism and discrimination. It is a result of racism and discrimination by a whole lot of different actors over time and in a lot of different ways, and by structural, I mean, racism is about structural, I mean, all that. So that statement is true. It is a true statement. But in terms of what you're trying to get at, and if you want your audience to be people who want to make changes, then it wouldn't hurt to flesh it out in some way that is shorter than that one sentence, but I mean longer than that one sentence, but shorter than, you know, the 15 pages describing the history of racism in our community. And I think that was probably the whole point, but that's really isn't, I don't even think the most important part of the changes. There were 2, I don't have it now in front of me, but there were 2 highlighted in the recommendations, 2 large highlighted paragraphs on the handout you got. And I thought, and one of them I think got partially integrated into this rewrite from the original I saw, but it was about something already existing. Now I can't find it. But I'm just saying, I would suggest, thank you, yeah. I have my computer. The 2 parts in the recommendations: develop and implement a comprehensive plan to foster community engagement in the work of eliminating racial disparity in this county's criminal justice system. The Restorative and Criminal Justice, Coordinating Council should oversee the drafting and implementation of this plan. If that didn't make it, I'm looking at too many versions of this, I'm getting confused, but if that's not in the version that the subcommittee put forward, you should consider that, because it's a specific direction and mentioning an existing body and what they're doing, and that's why I thought that was important. Maybe, is that the only one? Maybe that's the one I got excited about, but yeah, and if there's, and the rest of it are just some language changes, and I suggest, if we don't want to go through this all now, that you hash them out and have a look at it in the subcommittee. But just some things like right in the beginning on overview of community engagement, the racial disparities observed in Champaign County's criminal justice system and in other interlocking community agencies and institutions stem from an interplay of customs, procedures, rules, practices, et cetera. You see the changes that were made. I don't see that that is really changing the intent of saying result from race-based discrimination inherent in the system. I think it's clarifying more what you mean by that, so I thought it was a good change. And I just wish that people would, that everybody on the task force would look through this and, just look at each change and say yes, no, if you think that they are, good or not. But I thought read some of it was just like what Lynn and, has done it with, for the most part, in our task force with some of the things I wrote, of just trying to clean it up, in some places clarify it, in some places shorten it, to try to say what I think we all agree on. And that's what I'm wondering is, I don't know that we even have as much disagreement except in use of language, and we should fix that by trying to come to some consensus on language, or just concede that whoever wrote it gets to use their language. But I think that a lot of that is, we shouldn't be arguing about it, because I don't think we mean different things, other than this part that Lynn said that we shouldn't even address, and I don't want to address it either, is the whole saying that, well, there's 3 different things that contribute. And getting into the whole thing about whether or not more people being arrested for violent crime, more African Americans being arrested, a higher percent being arrested for violent crimes than for other kinds of crimes, is indicative of a different performance. I mean, that was David's point, and I think is true, is that you shouldn't say differences in arrests or even differences in convictions actually means differences in performance. And I think it's better if we don't even get into that. But this doesn't. Am I right? This isn't. I printed out what you sent. This does not say that. It doesn't, Lynn. It doesn't talk about. There are 3. It doesn't talk about. No, right? Yeah, and I don't think we should, because that's the controversial thing, which is why we shouldn't be
Asking for
talking about
tweaking
it.
of the language. That's what I was asking for.
Okay, and in response to what Esther just said, I think another reason I took this personally is Lynn sent us this recommendation, number 1, which is coming from us. It's coming from all of us, I realize, but it's also coming from our committee. She sent us this 2 weeks ago. We considered it. We thought it over, and we decided not to put it in.
And that's why she brought it tonight, because it's not your final. I'm sorry.
No, I understand. I do understand. We had a counter recommendation, which she deleted, which is in our proposal for an oversight committee. And I'm not saying this, but it's like if you say no, it comes back at you again and again and again. And one forum was suggested to us, and I appreciate the suggestion, I really do. And we looked it over and we thought about it. I think the consideration of it. And it's not something that I personally would recommend. I don't know the rest of the committee, but I mean, we did discuss it at length. So I guess what I'm saying is, since it's back on the table again, I did get upset.
Well,
Can I
I'm
just
sorry.
clarify?
Excuse me, can I just say something? This is a real important process question. Everybody, of course, you feel ownership over what you yourself wrote. But, when I write to someone and say, hey,
By the way,
I have
that
these
section I
concerns.
did not write. So it's not a matter of my
but not
personal
you personally,
ownership.
but the subcommittees are not individual entities to themselves. I mean, this has been a problem we've had. I felt from the start, and I mentioned it then, this idea that we're just going to all break up into, like, almost working as individuals. In the end, we have to all come together. And so, if I say, well, I have a problem with this, so, well, that's what the county board's getting. No, that's not what the county board's getting. The county board's going to get what a majority of the people on this task force vote to send to them. And I don't think it's the whole idea that, well, Lynn submitted this to you 2 weeks ago. And, well, you didn't agree with it, so you didn't put in your report, which is fine. But then there's nothing wrong with her bringing it forward to the whole group and saying, I think this is important, I'd like you to look at it.
Yeah, I think.
So I don't think she should be called out for this. I guess it amazes me that from where I sit, and not just because I'm on the subcommittee, but just looking at all these, I just see that one person is doing a whole lot of work, and if you don't agree with it, vote it down, but it's just wrong but I mean, even beyond procedure about calling people out, to criticize someone for advocating, for the process of bringing forward to the subcommittee something that someone else, to the whole task force, that someone on one subcommittee or a whole subcommittee said they didn't like. All of us have to decide we don't like it, or the majority of us have to decide we don't like it, to scrap it, and if a majority of us decide we want to include it, then we add it. And that's the way we need to work with all the sections, whether people, it's easier to ignore comments people make if they just orally make it, don't put it in writing. You take your notes and then you come up with a new thing. But if someone gives it to you in writing, then yeah, you need to go through it and see yes, no, and if we have to vote, we have to vote. But I don't think there's anything wrong with doing it this way. I think this is the way it should be done.
Okay, I'm going to leave this, but I just do want to read back 2 comments that, again, inflamed me, to say that what we wrote was not true, and I have quotes around that, and to say that we will lose. Those are inflammatory comments, at least to me. Got my ire going a little bit here, and I apologize if I've upset you in any way. I do appreciate, I tried to say that, I do appreciate the recommendations that were sent, but I also have to say that, as voice, not particularly mine, I hope, but as voice, we have a right to consider it. I do agree with you. We need to vote up or down. We need to move on. I totally get that.
First point out that my name has been mentioned several times throughout this meeting, and we can roll a tape back and hear that my name has been mentioned several times. In terms of providing feedback, I have also provided feedback to different groups as well. So when it talks about work ethic and being a part and having a voice in other groups that I am not a part of, I absolutely have been a part of that process. So, and I think people have echoed that here. I have a few concerns. The first is that the email that was sent out today regarding Lynn's concerns about feedback on the community engagement section at no time mentioned the email that was sent out yesterday to our subcommittee addressing requested language changes. Those are being discussed now, but that was not discussed in the email that was sent to us as a group. Instead, what was focused on were the areas about restorative justice and about funding, both of which were issues that we had brought up earlier in the July 13th writing of our report. So in response to her concerns, I want to respond for these changes in the language used in the Community Engagement Subcommittee final report and the RJTF final report in general. I want to specifically address to what was referred to in Lynn's email to our subcommittee as the deep concerns raised by some feedback received from others. I first want to start by reiterating our mission. The Champaign County Racial Justice Task Force seeks to address causes and impact of racial disparities in the jail population and in the criminal justice system more broadly. It will report findings and a list of recommendations to the county board and community. It is committed to working with all members of the public. That being said, I want to make 4 key points. First, racism, also regarded as race-based discrimination, is about power. It is about the domination of one racial group that necessitates the oppression of others. Racism, therefore, is about the production and maintenance of white supremacy based on the subordination of African Americans and other racialized communities, both locally and globally. By domination, I'm referring to social, political, economic, and cultural control over the resources and lives of select racial groups. Point 2, racial disparity is a byproduct of racism. Racial disparity currently is measured in 3 ways. 1, the disproportionate representation of a racial group in relation to their total population. For example, in Champaign County, African Americans consist of 13% of the county's total population and over 65% of the inmates in the county jail. 2, it's measured in terms of the inequitable treatment of blacks compared to whites, including African Americans being 4 times as likely to be stopped and arrested for similar offenses as whites. And we see this in the IDOT traffic study, particularly under the veil of darkness, which I mentioned in the police practices report, which was a section that I wrote that was actually praised here in this room. Third, measurement of racial disparity, the disparate impact or outcome of institutionalized practices, policies, and procedures that render select communities of color vulnerable, such as fines and fees that at their minimum put a greater economic burden on already low-income African Americans and others, which is a comment that was mentioned within the fees and fines, a section that I did not write but was tendered by Lynn and Sarah. So again, racial disparity is about power or institutionalized practices, policies, and procedures that thwart the life outcomes of African Americans. Thus, it is a byproduct of racism. Third, race-neutral policies and politics are also a byproduct of racism. Race neutrality appears to eliminate race or racial identifiers from the decision-making process, yet it implicitly uses race as a measure to mask incidents of racial disparity as mere coincidence, so that no one is held accountable for addressing incidents of racism within a given organization. This was also a critique that I made within the restorative justice practices, which resulted in some of the implementation regarding racial disparity that occurs within restorative justice practices that mask themselves as race neutral. For example, neutral policies such as zero tolerance in the schools have the appearance of treating everyone the same, but routinely allow for teachers to fall back on racial stereotypes, such as black children are more aggressive, black children need more discipline, black boys are actually black men, resulting in their over-disciplining of black youth. Overall, race-neutral policies largely ignore and ultimately depoliticize histories of racism in the form of inequitable social, political, and economic policies that includes gerrymandering to gentrification that significantly contribute to higher rates of poverty, underemployment, joblessness, arrest, hotspot policing, poor health outcomes, low academic achievement, and so on among African Americans and other communities of color. Last, Racism is about power, not emotion. It is about the collective and not the individual. Regardless of racial affiliation, there are several people who adhere to and support a system of oppression that reproduces and maintains the social, political, and economic cultural domination of African Americans and other racialized communities. To turn a conversation about racial disparity into a dialogue about white shame and white fragility, or calling someone racist, which was basically said in the email to us as was mislabeled, is to further silence the voices of those who offer a well-researched and well-supported critique of race, power, and language that is central and indeed necessary for fulfilling our mission as a Champaign County Racial Justice Task Force.
Any additional comments or thoughts?
Just quickly, I was asking for tweaking of 4 sentences, and the other 2, I'm flagging for future discussion. I have no objection to the commission. The alternative body was the coordinating council, and then also we're going to talk about funding priorities. So I know this has been a emotional discussion, and maybe that's a good thing, because we're going to have a lot of harder discussions as a community, and we can learn from this. But that's what I was asking for.
Okay.
And I want to make one comment, and directed to Esther. I think everybody's responses and comments were in response to Lynn's edits, and I don't think, well, I didn't get, or I don't see that she was attacked. But I think there also is around the issues of discussion of race and how we differently interpret and respond to it. So again, I feel like that's a way to silence people who are very much affected by racist practices when we respond and somehow we become the attacker. So anybody who knows me knows that I'm a very direct person, and I do not skirt an issue. And so I found that problematic, that in response to her comments, somehow she got attacked. And so I certainly didn't attack her, and I don't feel like any of the other people who responded to her comments were attacking her. So just because in other people's inputs or comments, people kind of agreed or something, but when you don't agree does not mean that it's an attack.
No, but when you tell someone they talk too much and the people left the task force because of it, that is an attack, and it's not, I don't believe it to be a truthful statement either.
I do talk too much, but I got braces several days ago and I can't now. So I'm okay with that. Thank you.
I just want to add, as one of the authors with some of the language here where suggestions have been made, that there's room for tweaking some of this and perhaps explicating things a little bit more. But one of our intents is to be provocative. We're not going to paper this over. And our group started out saying we're not going to use race-neutral language. We want people to confront the issue and all the ramifications of it, and that is the whole point of community engagement, and that's why we're using the language we're using.
All right, any other thoughts?
I'm just wondering, we have a couple more sections in thinking about process for, I think in my understanding and my impression so far, the idea is that we're getting feedback from others to the subcommittee work, and then at some point we will present kind of a final draft of each section that will then get a vote, yay or nay, as from a majority. Is that an assumption I'm making about the process?
I think we have that under new business, or you want to skip
okay, so
there?
we'll discuss that later, sure.
All right. All right, our next section is structural.
Thank you. I want to start by thanking the several people that I listed who have helped with comments on that. The 4 who were most helpful of all, just because they took time to meet with me on this and really go through several things, were Artis and Henry Ross, who are on the subcommittee, Ryan and Bert Stabler. Is it Stabler or Stabler? And they had specific things to say, and they had specific things from the report in some bulk, and that was good. And then other people who helped very much were Joycelyn Landrum Brown, who read through the entire thing and made comments on that and the references. And then Esther and Carolyn and Demario and Sarah and Lynn all gave comments that were incorporated into this and helped very much, so I thank you all. There were several changes that are made. This is substantially shorter. No snide comments there. It's only 9 pages instead of 16 of text now. Some of the things that are changed are the last section on reparations we took out completely. And Artis and I'll continue to work on that one, but for a different venue than this one probably. As he gets time, he's going, oh, no. Another big change is that you'll notice as you read this version that people's comments of tying this to the criminal justice system, not community justice system, those ties are made. And also I've tied this to the community meetings that we had at the beginning of this process. And I think Carolyn helped me do that one with her comments in part, because we wanted to know how to put the voice of the community into this, and we didn't have a way to do this that was formal. And I noticed in the community engagement section there are many things that are repeated. They're similar to what we have in our section too. That's very important to us. Another thing we did was tied this structural racism to how it tied into criminal justice. And I think as you reread this, you'll see that we've done that in a similar way. We've added the ties there of how the racism in the community makes criminal justice disparities as an outcome or a manifestation of the racism, just what people were talking about here. What we've tried to do in this report as a subcommittee is to open a space for thinking and practitioners and practice, for thinking and practice around racism and how it's affected the institutions, the thoughts, the norms, and so on that have caused disparities in many different places in the community, one of them being the criminal justice system. We also looked at language, and several people talked about language and advised taking out anything that could seem even the least bit judgmental. Our goal wasn't to be judgmental or moralizing, but it was to present honestly what we heard from people whom we interviewed. We can't guarantee that what people said isn't upsetting, of course, but we didn't shape fear of people not reading the report or not liking the report. We didn't let that shape the way we wrote the results. That's like having a research paper where you change the results or shape them to be biased in favor of the research, and that's not what we were doing. We also ultimately resisted some of the things that people were saying about, oh, the county board won't like this, or nobody will read this, or this will invalidate everything else that people have done, as one way of posturing and bullying to try to get the report to go in a way that they wanted it to go. And we did not do that. We think that in order to let progress be real, what we found has to be real. And if people don't want to read it, okay. But on the other hand, we think a lot of people will read it. There are about 12 people in the community who have read it, including some of the people who were mentioned in it or who gave rise to the recommendations in it without being named. And we always took their comments sincerely and worked them into the report. We were looking for what Imani Bazel has called root causes, what causes these disparities. And we don't think that the criminal justice system can alone solve problems of disparities in criminal justice or anything else. But the root cause is racism here. Let's see, let me look real quickly. Were there other changes? Because you asked for changes first. Okay, I don't know that people have had a chance to read this. So I don't know, Sam, whether it would be better to discuss more now if people have read the newest version, which is shorter and which doesn't have some of the things that the other versions had, or whether you want us to wait.
Maybe it is that after it is we've had a chance to review it, that may be more appropriate. Go ahead.
Well, I think some general, I mean, we do need more time to review it to go through each point, but I just have one very general comment, and it's on the issue of investigation of truth. There are a number of statements in here that are actually not accurate, that are based on individual people's stories. And something needs, if you want to, if the purpose of this, or if there's a section of this to give voice to people's stories, then we can say, people said these things. But when we state something as fact, and then the footnote is that one person, or during some community engagement thing said this, that's not a fact. And when I think
Could you give me an
all
example?
right, for example,
That'd
the
be
University of
helpful.
Housing Division did not prohibit African Americans from living in the residence halls
what
until
page-
1968.
what
Oh,
page
the
are
right,
we
the
on?
first page. I'm sorry, the first page, your initial arrow bullet points.
Okay.
Someone said that, and I think what they misunderstood, this happened, I mean, these things jumped out at me because I know about housing. When the Project 500 program started, I mean, when they initiated it, they didn't do it right, so that they didn't arrange housing for all the kids that they recruited here. But housing, the University of Illinois, if you were a senior at a high school and had already been accepted to U of I and you were African American, there weren't many of you, but if you were separate from the 500 program, yeah, you might very well have gotten a room at Illinois Street Residence Halls or Men's Residence Hall or something. The Housing Division did not exclude African Americans till 1968. I'm not sure. I tried to find out when it changed, and I don't know. I know the Housing Authority of Champaign County was racially segregated until 1958. So I'm thinking U of I probably changed around that same time. And related to that, the next one, there was...
Wait.
Okay.
That information is from the Chancellor's office at the University of Illinois.
That wasn't cited as the citation.
That's
here.
right.
The Chancellor's office of U of I told you that they prohibited blacks from living in the residence halls till 1968?
Yes. And I can go back and check on that because it's
Yeah, would you
possible.
please?
I will indeed.
I
Because,
can
you know-
also
And I
share
d-
some information with you, as that was part of my dissertation research, so it's fairly accurate.
68 was the year they changed it.
Well, see, there was different policies that were in place that weren't actually written. They were customary, and so it was encouraged that folks of color would find residence outside the campus until a later period in which you have the influx, and that's after the 1964 Higher Education Acts. And so then you start seeing a slow increase of African Americans on campus. Now, for women of color in particular, they were able to get dormitory housing a lot earlier than
the
African.
YWCA built.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
it's not far off, but I would agree that the citation more than one person's statement would be beneficial.
Right.
But I understand the concern.
But what jumped at me was 68 because that was the year that the Federal Fair Housing Act passed, and
Well-
the civil rights legislation. In education, that was earlier. But anyway, I'm just saying that those are
I
things
will-
to look into.
Esther, I'll
Yeah,
go back
uh-huh.
with that one, and I will check that through the Chancellor's office and the university history. I'll check with
Okay.
Sam if you have more references,
Yeah.
and make that accurate.
Yeah.
I also know that people I talked to who were in that Project 500 group, who were African American, were not allowed to be on campus for libraries in the evening, and they weren't allowed to live on campus. So somewhere in here, we'll have to find,
They weren't allowed to live on campus.
they weren't allowed to live on
You-
campus.
By
They
on
were
campus,
den-
you mean university residence
They were
halls.
denied university housing, right? And they had
Okay.
to find a place in the community.
Yeah, my understanding was they were denied, that people who came through that program they did not have housing for them because no one bothered to arrange it. But anyway, I'm just saying, look at that. And likewise,
This
on Lakeside Terrace.
predates the Project 500 in terms of housing and housing policies that the university implemented. But again, we can get
Yeah.
a
I know,
little
I'm saying,
more.
I'll work on
I
that,
know the
that's
university
good.
used to not let African Americans live in, I'm just saying 68, I think is the wrong year, and I don't know if it's 10 years late, but I'm pretty sure it's the wrong year. But I don't know, but I would look into it. And just likewise, on the story from the 1950s, I think it's wonderful if someone remembers it as this racially integrated place, but Lakeside Terrace was the white public housing, and in 1958 is when they started letting people in, because that's when the Housing Authority changed their policy.
No, the
But she
person
said
who,
she lived there in 52?
the person grew up in that housing. She's definitely black,
But she moved in 52?
probably.
That's interesting.
I will go back and check with her because I know who it is. Where are we in the,
But anyway, I'm just saying there are a few things like, there's
I
a
know
number of
where
these
you
things
are.
that are what people said. I mean, I read the footnotes, I see it's what people said, and which doesn't mean, like the same things about teachers not, discouraging children from black African-American children from going, let's see, where is it? I mean, the whole thing about pushing kids into job training rather than higher education, all that. I'm just thinking in the context of when I suggested that we say that the Police Training Institute at the University of Illinois has a better program for educating police officers about racism and racial disparities, and you're saying, well, can we really prove that? And someone said she used the Bradley University had a good one and all that. Think, okay, if that's the kind of standard we're using, then anecdotal comments shouldn't be presented as statements of most teachers in the school, most white teachers in the school, grade children differently. I mean, and all those things, those are individual people's comments. And I'm not saying we shouldn't give support. It's hard to say in this 9, which is really 15-page thing, but I could say like under number 7. I don't know, I'm just trying, in general, it's throughout the document. That's what's hard. If you want, I will be happy that no one will be offended by it to send you a strike-through and all that, but I'm just saying there are a
no,
number of
don't do
things here
that.
that are.
We'll sit
yeah.
down and go through that one by one.
But that's the
good.
thing, is to try to sort out,
Yes,
if what
that's
you want to
fine.
do is give voice to people's comments, have a section on giving voice to people's, during community engagement, people said, and then you can say all those things.
No,
but
this
it's
is
important
not-
not to state them as fact.
This is not that. This is a report on what people who live, work, have gone to school, retired in Champaign County, what they have said. This is a report of the community's voice.
This whole
Now,
section, you mean?
Yeah,
is?
there's nothing in here that's,
Okay.
that's
Okay, because it starts, the
editorialized.
opening sentence is, the Champaign County Board is investigating the evidences and effects of racism within its towns, cities, countryside, and then it starts, it never really gets into it doesn't separate out what we are saying to be fact and what other people are describing as their experience as individuals. And I think it's important to separate those two. And particularly the part about teachers, I thought teachers are probably, some teachers might be annoyed at that, would say that's not true, and who knows if it's true or not. And what we should do is look into, how we measure whether it's true or give direction on, this is what people say, how do we figure it out, and what are the remedies for it, or something like that. But I just think those two things are so woven together in this. That's really is just a general problem that I had with the whole way it's reading. And then there are a few other just, specific things that are just the word things like, Urbana does have a full-time SRO program. It's just different from the Champaign one. So we should say it, we should, and I think in one of the reports, I think that we just went over, was that Restorative Justice? One of them mentioned that and got it and explained it in more detail. Just saying some of those things are.
Urbana's
need-
SRO program is not a full-time in the schools like Champaign's is. That wording comes from the Urbana School District, and I can go over it again with, I didn't go over with Sam, but I went over
Okay.
with somebody else in administration, but I can go over that again and make sure.
I know, I'm just saying in terms of the clarity
Yeah.
that one part of the report says that there are school resource officer programs in Champaign and Urbana and Rantoul, and compares the data, which actually, somewhere in my mind, I thought I read it in your report, or maybe it was in your long version, and I thought that made the real, was that your section, was that juvenile justice, or was it in the juvenile justice section? And I'm just saying, it's some of these things that just when it's really just, it's too short a statement, because a person reading that sounds like Urbana doesn't have an SRO and Champaign does. And your recommendation is retire the SRO program, but maybe reference to the part in juvenile justice that gives the data, that seems to be the place to argue, get rid of the SRO. I mean, I'm all for getting rid of the school resource officer, but I think that what was included in the juvenile justice section captures that. I mean, it gives some numbers and shows some differences, although it's still hard to compare Champaign and Urbana because they have different kinds of programs. And maybe that's what you were trying to say. But I'm just saying there are a number of places where I'm looking at these things, and it seems almost like there is a mix in the writing of it, and I don't know, between anecdotal and non-anecdotal, and I'm just suggesting as a general way of approaching something like this, trying to separate those things out so we know what we're reading. And I think that might be one of the reasons, for the reaction to this being that, gosh, this just doesn't fit with everything else, is because it has that mix. And I don't know if that helps at all, but I think, I don't know, I agree with some, well, I think that this needs to be reworked in some way to make it address racial disparity in the criminal justice system, and I don't know that, I don't agree that we need to go all the way back. I mean, if we need to talk about the history of all the things that have, I mean, if you want to talk about the history of racism, it needs to be longer than this, actually, which is, I know that's what you started doing, and I don't know that that is really as important as focusing in on what is going on today and what we want people to do about making change. I guess that's the thing, that's the most important part, I think, of this task force report is what changes do we want to see and how much can we substantiate it? And that's, I don't know, and I think a list of recommendations, though this isn't quite as long, still 22 recommendations is, I know you said, Amy said she didn't care if people are turned off by this or whatever. I do care a great deal. I don't want to just write something that we all feel so good about, but that people just reject. I want to make it hard for them to say no to our recommendations. And maybe that's, I mean, they will anyway, but I
We
just
have
think that's something
quite
to
a
think
bit of
about, so,
specific recommendations in here. I'd like to talk with you later about this too, but hiring more African Americans in the school system is a pretty specific recommendation.
Yes, it is, yeah.
Expanding and using the national name exchange, which our schools don't use and only Parkland knows about. Well, U of I has some students there, but there's no high school students who aren't prepared for that program, and it's a marvelous program all over the country. Discussing race and racism in the school system openly is something that only one school has started doing so far. Ending the detentions and suspensions that the kids I talked to just are, they talked about it. They talked about holding pens. They talked about teachers' smell of fear, things like that.
Yeah, I don't think that should, I mean, if you want, that's a perfect example of, if you want to say, children said this, but it shouldn't be, I don't think it should be a headline topic about end the system of detention suspensions.
Well, it starts
they
with
smell of fear and inadequacy.
It starts with, here are their suggestions for change.
Yeah, okay.
All right, so
So-
we
Yeah, all right.
can stay kind of
Oh, yeah.
on target. Yes, sir. Yes.
Yes, just reading this report, and I'm going to kind of jump around here, and maybe we need to change it from structural. And I know when it first started, it was education and employment. So the structure kind of make people look at this as a different light, because once I read it, I kind of looked at it in a different light also. One thing about this report is I have noticed that in this report, it do touch on a little bit of different subcommittee topics within this report, because they talk about restorative justice and some other things. And maybe should be named, how racism contribute to injustice, through like redlining, denied jobs, and also the history of denial of people of color opportunities. Just a few notes I wrote here, and let me say this: after looking at this real close, if this body decide to put this report in, I'm thinking it's something that probably need to be put at the end of the report, so that people, once they read it, it has a lot of information in there dealing with racism, implicit bias, explicit bias. It talks about these type of things. I think the main idea of this was, let's say if a person go through our whole report from the different topics that we have tackled, that people will look at this and get a better understanding how racism is, Some of the recommendations is just basically, how do we improve racism? How do we improve race relationship within our county? I think that's what it was, more in line I was trying to do. It's an overview of racism. That's kind of what this report is. And so I think once we read it and look at it as an overview of racism, and with the recommendation on what we can do to change some of the racism that goes on in our community, I think we'd be probably real served by that. I'm sure, we will be served by that. There are things that we need to look at. I think the report does kind of jump around a little too much. It need to be more condensed, more focused in certain areas. And once we did that, maybe it could work. But then again, it does not really address proper injustice in our system, but it do address some of the causes of it. And do we want to put that type of thing in our report? It's something that the body here we have to decide. The committee need to meet again and discuss this. We definitely need input from, I'm going to say everyone here, on some different things that can be laid out in this. As most of you know, I have not assisted Amy much as I would have liked to. I've been doing a lot of different things. I've been having a lot of personal problems that I've been dealing with in my life. But I'm not making any excuses. I'm just saying that I have not contributed as much as I would like to. So I'm asking other people here to help so that we can get this, if we decide to put this in there, because right now it's just dealing mostly with racism in our community and a recommendation of what we can do about it. Thank you.
Okay. All right.
Okay, so I first would like to say that I would like a chance to review this section because I have not had that opportunity. But with that being said, there are some things that I am specifically looking for within this report. The first one, making sure that any recommendations are working within the criteria that we have established to focus on racial disparity within the criminal justice system. I think recommendations need to be tied back to that, and even any discussion of structural racism or implicit bias or whatever else we want to use terminology, it needs to come back to talking about within the criminal justice system, and it needs to be explicit about that. So it needs to focus on practices, policies, and procedures that are institutionalized. So that's my critique for now until I have a chance to actually read this and provide additional feedback. I am glad to see that it has been shortened down to 9 pages. That saves me a lot. I remember reading the first 37-page rendition of this. So I'm glad for the remix. Thank you.
All right. And so just in respect of time, I want to try and get us to the next agenda items. New business on budget. Was there anything in particular that needed to be discussed? Or is that something that we want to take up next time? Okay. I'm seeing head nods, so we are going to move that to our next meeting. So a postponement, do we need to vote on that? Or do we just table? All right, all in favor? Those opposed? Okay. Plan for final report draft. I think that's, okay. We're gonna, and do we already have a subgroup in place that is continuing to work on the drafts? No? Or is that just something that, okay, so we're still working on those subcommittee drafts and we'll come back to the table during our next meeting. Is there a motion to table? All right, second. Is there a second?
And then just discussion on that real quick would just
No.
be that, can we do discussion on that?
Well, if we're gonna table it.
Oh,
no.
sorry, I thought we got that.
Okay.
Not on a
Wait.
table? Oh, okay.
Excuse me, point of order. A motion to table is not up for discussion, but you aren't trying, now, in both of those, you didn't mean to table, because table means kill it forever. It was a motion to postpone consideration to the next meeting. Yeah. Well, that's the same thing, but just like, to the next meeting is the difference between, okay.
So the minutes should reflect till the next meeting.
It has to, otherwise we kill it. That was just my point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we didn't get the second one. You second it? Okay. All those in favor?
Aye.
Those opposed? Okay. Say that one more time. All right. We have one opposed. Motion carries. Last agenda item is adjournment. All right, we're adjourned. Okay.